Hello, everyone. It's good to be here to talk to you, and I'm going to try to give you a bit of a social science perspective on the Southampton Women's Survey. But it's important first to understand how the study came about, and really that was about the Lifecourse approach to non-communicable disease risk, so diseases like heart disease and stroke, and a recognition that really to influence disease risk, we need to intervene very early in the life course. The green rectangles really are the phases of particular interest to us, so the mother, the infant, child and adolescent, but actually increasingly recognizing that it's before conception even that we really want to intervene. So we want to influence the health of women and their partners before they conceive. And nationally and internationally, that's really become very well recognized now, and you'll be very familiar with the Lifecourse approach. And in the Southampton Women's Survey, the unique thing about the study is that it has preconception data. It began by recruiting women who were not pregnant at the time. And even though that started in 1998, it's still pretty unique. I mean, there are some other European studies recently being created and some international where they are collecting preconceptional data, but really not many. And most mother offspring cohort studies tend to start in pregnancy or even after birth. So that really is a pretty unique feature of the Southampton Women's Survey, and one to bear in mind. So it began in 1998, set up by a team of people, but led by Professor Hazel Inskip, who many of you may know, and who's just retired, but remains in an emeritus role, so will still very much be involved. Over 12,000 women were resident in Southampton were recruited who weren't pregnant. And then anyone who subsequently became pregnant was followed up through their pregnancy in some detail. And their children, there were over 3,000 births, were then followed up at regular intervals through infancy and into childhood. So there were follow-ups at 6 and 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, age 4, 6 to 7, 8 to 9, and most recently 11 to 13 years. And the young people now are aged, their ages span roughly from about the age of 14 or 15 up to 20, because obviously they were born over a period of time, not all in the same year. And fitting with that sort of life course interest and non-communicable disease interest, there was a lot of emphasis on diet and body composition at all phases of the study. And so women were interviewed in their homes and asked in particular detail about their diet, but other things as well. So those interviews were administered by research nurses. And there were measurements in pregnancy, there were anthropometric measurements, both of mother and child. And here you can see various photos showing you some of the measurements. So just really wanted to give you that sort of background so you understand where the study was coming from originally. I was asked to tell you about how you access the data, SWS data. If you look at our website, then under cohorts within the MRC LEC website, there is a link for the Southampton Women's Survey. And within that, you can easily get to the data dictionary. And that's populated with all the variables at the different sweeps. So you can have a look through the different follow-up phases and look at the variables that are available. Then the process really is, if you have a proposal, a research question you'd like to address, we ask that people put together a short proposal, 1 to 2 pages, and send that to us so that the leadership team, who I'll mention at the end of the talk, can consider that. So you can very easily just email me directly or my colleague Sarah Crozier, who's the lead statistician. And the leadership team would consider it, and if accepted, which most are, then we asked researchers to sign up and become collaborators on the study and sign some collaboration agreements. And that is because of the way the original consent was handled for women. So people are not allowed to access the data unless they become part of the study team. Obviously, the Closer Discovery platform is another source of information about the data collected. And I know from having a look yesterday that the description of variables in the early sweeps is available on the Closer platform. And I'm sure over time more gets added. I know it's a slow and difficult job. So as I said, the main focus really was on diet, health behaviours, body composition, but nevertheless, over time, there was always an interest really in social factors, because after all, they are very strong influences on people's health behaviours. So I tried to sort of pick out some of the things that I think might be of interest to you from more of a sort of social science perspective, thinking about social factors. We have measures of mental health amongst the mothers. So pre-conception, the GHQ-12, General Health Questionnaire 12-item version, was used. And so that gives a measure of preconceptional distress or anxiety. And I'll come back to that. So those measures of mental health in the mothers, and I'll come back and tell you some of the relevant findings. I'm going to give you some case studies so you get some feel for what's possible. Educational attainment in the mothers is something we've measured and has proved to be a really important factor when thinking about things like women's diet, and I'll come back to that too. But I wanted particularly to mention the follow-up at 2 years and 3 years, where some of the data we collected I think will be of particular interest. So at the 2-year follow-up, there was a recognition that it was important to know a bit more about social factors and the sort of lives that people live. And so we've got a wealth of data at that follow-up. And if you go to the website, you can actually look through the questionnaire, but you will also look through the data dictionary and see what's available. So we have data on childcare arrangements, housing, both type of housing, but also quality. The sort of the quality in terms of damp, condensation, roof leaking, lack of space, that sort of thing, but also of a woman's perception of her neighbourhood, vandalism, litter, traffic, noise, crime. We have data on the mother and her partner in relation to employment, whether they were part-time, full-time, what was their current job or most recent job, whether they experience any financial difficulties and have access to a car. We also asked about their main shop. We know about receipt of benefits, and we also know about sleeping arrangements and whether the child shares a room, wakes up at night, and indeed the duration of sleep. And we have measured sleep at other follow-ups as well, so and indeed published some research on sleep. So we have some reasonably good data on sleep. At the 3-year follow-up, as well as the sort of general questionnaire that was about diet and health behaviours, we also administered the SDQ, Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, to find out about the child's behaviour. Again, we measured sleep, and we also had a measure of parenting, so a measure of closeness and conflict in that parent-child relationship using the Pianta questionnaire. So I just thought I'd whiz through a few examples of the sorts of research that we've been interested when thinking about social factors, to give you a flavour of what might be possible. So obviously a big focus has been on diet, both of the mothers and of their children. This summarises an awful lot of work really, but essentially in the study we used food frequency questionnaires for the women and for the children and developed measures of diet quality. And for the women, we developed something called a prudent diet score. And basically, someone with a high score was somebody with a very healthy diet, rich in fruit and vegetables, high in fibre, all sorts of things you associated with good healthy diet, and low in all of the things you'd associate with an unhealthy diet. And all of these factors were important in influencing diet amongst the women, but educational attainment, level of educational attainment, was the strongest predictor. And just to show you some data about that, so here we have women's percentages of women in the lowest quarter of prudent diet score. So they're the people with the poorest quality diets, and you can see that those without educational qualifications actually were more likely to have a poor quality diet. And when we went on to look at how the number of children might interact with that, in general, women with more children were less likely to have a good quality diet. So perhaps suggesting the challenges of having more children and possibly the financial issues that come with that played a role. When we looked at, I mean, these are just very brief summaries of what were many studies really. When we looked at the infant's diet, when we think about that infant phase, we similarly came up with a diet quality score, which we named the infant guidelines score, where something that had a high diet that had a high score was one that reflected the current guidance on healthy eating. So higher score was a better diet. And we found all of these factors important, but mother's pre-pregnant prudent diet score was the most important. So a mother with a diet of poor quality pre-pregnancy, her infant was most likely to have a lower quality diet as well, as you can see from this slide here. So a lot of research into diet and a lot of data available, and I didn't mention the 4-year follow-up where we have a subset who had cognitive development assessed, but we were able to look at the infant diet and the quality of that in relation to IQ, and certainly there was a suggestion that infants with better diets also had a higher IQ, independent of confounding factors, although one can't be sure about residual confounding inevitably, as in any cohort study. So just to summarize some of those findings, I haven't told you about some of our important work on preparation for pregnancy, or indeed on the body composition of the child. But in general, mothers with poor quality diets went on to have infants with diets of poorer quality too, and that subsequently had effects both in infancy and childhood, early childhood. So just to give you a flavour of some of the other mental health outcome work that we've done, just to indicate what might be feasible. Preconceptional distress wasn't associated with birth weight. Red cell folate was associated with depressive symptoms in the women, but not longitudinally, so suggesting perhaps reverse causation, so women who were depressed less likely to eat well. Red cell folate gives you a sort of measure of someone's nutritional status, if you like. We found that infant sleep disturbance was associated with preconceptional distress. And I've just told you about the behavioural problems findings. In relation to glycemic load, a high glycemic load in the diet is a less healthy pattern, if you like. And that during pregnancy was associated with an increased risk of postnatal depression, but there wasn't a relationship with preconceptional distress and glycemic load in pregnancy. Lastly, just to mention briefly, just trying to draw on some more of those 2-year data on social factors, we looked at crowding and in the home and its relationship with the behaviour of the child at 3 years. And we also tried to look at effect modifiers in that relationship. Just looking at the data, we found that a relationship between crowding and behavioural problems. So the more crowded the home, and PPR stands for persons per room. and is a measure of crowding. So a relationship, a linear relationship. And we went on to carry out some linear regression analyses and found that in a household that's more crowded by one person per room, the child is more likely to have behavioural problems. That was weakened, but nevertheless remains statistically significant after adjustment for confounding factors. We looked at a host of mediating factors, and obviously that's one of the benefits of the longitudinal data that we have, and that rich data at 2 years. And we found that mother having depression was the greatest influence in terms of a mediating effect, but also children sleeping less, mothers who were stressed, and when parent-child relationships had more conflict and less closeness. So those were the sort of case studies I picked out to tell you about. I'll just finish by acknowledging the leadership team. So as well as myself and Sarah Crozier on that team, Cyrus Cooper is the director of our unit, Keith Godfrey, Nick Harvey are both programme leaders within the unit, and of course Hazel Inskip, who you might know, indeed set up the study to start with and will still remain heavily involved. And obviously I'd just like to acknowledge all the women and their children and young people who take part in the study, and funders and all the various members of the research team. Thank you.